Hello again. One of the things which I find most perplexing is the way in which newspapers and television news programmes seem to have a very narrow range of things in which they display an interest. Obviously, the sex lives of footballers and pop stars are of interest to many people, and although they're not really my thing, I quite see why so many column inches are devoted to who's screwing whom. I've been thinking lately about another aspect of this matter, which is that the mainstream media have their own very clear ideas about which wars they will report on. If a stray rocket or artillery shell lands on a hospital or orphanage in Gaza, you can be quite sure that the media will be there to examine the aftermath and will be treated to close-up pictures of children covered in blood. In the same way, a soldier killed on the border between North and South Korea guarantees a mention on the news. Kashmir is a remote part of the world, and yet if the Indians, Chinese or Pakistanis open up with artillery there, you'll certainly be reading about it the next day in your newspaper. Because of this, I can't help wondering why a war which is being fought in Europe is hardly ever talked about. We're all of us familiar with the trenches on the Western Front during the First World War. We learned about them at school, of course, and most of us regard them as little more than an historical curiosity. Thank goodness that war isn't like that these days, we say. It's all high tech now with drones and smart bombs, robots, and I don't know what all else. What a mercy that men aren't huddled in trenches in the middle of winter, waiting for the enemy artillery to start pounding their position. Well, that's precisely what it is like right now in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. The thumbnail to this video shows one of these trenches in a photograph taken a few days ago. This may possibly come as a surprise to many people. Just as trench warfare for most people is something from history, so too is the Crimea. We know about the war there in the 1850s. Everyone's heard of the Crimean War, the charge of the Light Brigade, and Florence Nightingale had something to do with it, didn't she? But that's about it. It's something from history. The Crimea is a very large part of the Ukraine, a peninsula with an area of about 10,000 square miles. That's about twice the size of Northern Ireland, just to give you some idea of how big the Crimea is. It's on the Black Sea, and there's a very important naval base there, Sevastopol. That again, of course, is another name from history. In 2014, the Russians decided that they would like to add Crimea to their own territory, and so they seized it by armed force. At about the same time, they began taking more land from the Ukraine in the east. This was partly done through mercenaries, also by regular Russian troops. The aim is ultimately to destabilise the Ukraine so that Russia can expand even more, and the Ukrainians are resisting fiercely any encroachment on their territory, which is why it's become bogged down now in trench warfare, with the Russians and their allies on one side and the Ukrainian army on the other. This is a war which has been going on now for 7 years, with hardly any mention at all about it in the British or American television or press. In the last few weeks, things have become even worse because the Russian army has mobilised and moved thousands of troops, supported by heavy armour, tanks and troop carriers, artillery, to the Ukrainian border. The reason is very simple. Vladimir Putin has been in power in Russia now for 20 years, and he signed a law a few days ago which makes it possible for him to remain president until 2036. Although there's no real political opposition in Russia, as in an opposition party, Putin's personal popularity ratings have fallen lately, and he wants to make people forget about the problems in his regime. The best way to do this, of course, is a short and successful war. This is an absolutely surefire strategy. It worked brilliantly in this country, of course, a few years ago. At the beginning of 1982, Margaret Thatcher was hugely unpopular, and the opinion polls predicted a catastrophic defeat for her if a general election was held. Fortunately, General Galtieri of Argentina had the same sort of problem, and he thought that he could boost his own popularity by invading the Falkland Islands that spring. It distracted the people of Argentina from their problems for a little while, but of course the British then launched a counter-attack, invaded the islands and won, upon which Galtieri fell, and Margaret Thatcher had a landslide victory in the general election the following year. Result. Of course, a little matter of refugees is another of those things that newspapers are very, very specific about what kind they're interested in. Some refugee problems, that of the Palestinians, say, are still regularly mentioned in the news 73 years after they left the country. Similarly, the refugees from various African wars are often talked about. Hand on heart, has anybody heard anything being said on the news about the 1.5 million refugees from the fighting in the Ukraine? Is it because they're white Europeans? Because the Ukrainians have done their best to resettle all those people? It's one of the greatest refugee crises of recent years, and yet nobody wants to talk about it and the newspapers won't mention it. Where are all the appeals for help for Ukrainian refugees? I think that most of us know, deep down, the answer to this. Historically, it's left-wing types who organise protests about wars and draw attention to a refugee crisis. Because of the old sentimental affection which the left wing has for the former Soviet Union, there's a marked reluctance to criticise the Russians. So it is that none of the usual rules are applied by either charitable organisations or the media towards the conflict in Ukraine. The only time anybody in the West ever sits up and takes notice is when the Russians overstep the mark and shoot down an aeroplane belonging to another country, as happened with the Malaysian airliner in 2014. As long as they're only killing Ukrainians, though, everybody's happy to turn a blind eye.